SaberSim's new rules update gives you an unprecedented level of control over your DFS lineups, and I am so excited to walk through these here today in this video. My name's Jordan Chan, I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and I can confidently say that this is SaberSim's biggest feature update of all time, so let's go ahead and just dive into it and start walking through it. You can access these new powerful rules by clicking the Lineup Rules tab on your home screen and clicking Add New Rule. By default, the rule type will be set to stack, which is how you'll set basic stacking rules for your lineups. You can control how many different players you want on your primary team, what positions you want to include, and the teams that are included. And in sports where you can have positive correlations on the opposing team, like NFL, you can control what teams you want on the opposing team. Now, this is going to look pretty familiar to those that have used the advanced stacking rules before, but now this is ready for all different sports and it's much more simplified and easier to use. Let's go ahead and add another rule, this time as a group, and this is where it starts to get really fun. So for the Thursday night showdown between the Steelers and Browns, I'm going to add another rule and I'm going to specify a group. It's going to be a manual group here. We'll talk more about automatic in a second, but a manual group is basically one where you're picking the players manually that go into the particular group. A common rule I see people want to make all the time is saying, I don't want to play Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, for example, in the same showdown lineup together. I'll go ahead and specify both of those guys at both captain and flex here, and I can set a simple rule that says use no more than one of these guys in my lineup, which means when SaberSim builds your lineups, you won't get both Cleveland running backs in the same lineup together. Now, let's take this one step further and create a conditional manual rule. In this case, I'm going to say if I'm going to be using one of the high-powered Steelers wide receivers at captain, I want to make sure Mitch Trubisky is in as my flex. I can add another rule, create a group rule, make sure it's a manual, and this time I'm going to create a conditional by saying if at least one primary player is used, then we have to use a particular secondary player. I'm going to go ahead here and quickly find the big Steelers wide receivers. So we'll do Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, and George Pickens as captains. If one of these players is used, then we want to make sure that Mitch Trubisky is used in the flex spot. Now, this rule will only work if one of these Steelers wide receivers is used at captain, but anytime one of those guys is in a captain spot, we'll always make sure Mitch Trubisky is in his flex. Now, manual rules are great, but if you have a lot of them to make, they can start to take up a lot of your time, which is where automatic groups come into play. Automatic groups allow you to tell us what the logic is that you're making your group, and then we'll make all of the rules that correspond all at once. I think it's easier to understand with an example, so let's go ahead and return to what we were just doing before, where we said we don't want to include more than one Cleveland Browns running back in a given lineup for the showdown. What if we wanted to do the same thing for the NFL main slate? Now, there's 26 teams on this slate, and it would take a long time to create a manual rule for every single team specifying we don't want more than one of their running backs. We can do this all at once for every team on the slate with an automatic rule. Let's go ahead and add another rule here, and we're going to say a rule type is a group. This time, it's going to be an automatic rule. In this case, we're going to use a similar logic. We're going to say use no more than one primary player. The group by is basically how are you grouping these players together? How are you thinking about these players? How many rules are you making for this particular group? In this case, because we're talking about it at a team level, I don't want to use more than one running back from the same team in a given lineup. The group by is going to be team, and I'm going to specify only running backs here. So in this case, use no more than one primary player for a given running back on the same team. When you're saving your rules, you have two different ways to do it. You can save it as an auto rule or a manual rule. Now, what's going to happen here is an auto rule is dynamic. It will adjust as information changes about the slate. Will automatically, if, for example, a team cut one of their running backs at the last second and signed a new guy from the practice squad, an auto rule would automatically dynamically adjust to that and factor that in. Your manual rules create all of the rules that follow your logic at that particular moment, but they're static from there. They don't change. How I typically recommend using this is first create them as manual rules because this will allow you to troubleshoot and make sure the rule is working the way you expected. When you save it as a manual rule, you can go over here and check for each individual team if the rule applied correctly. For the Rams, for example, we can go ahead here now and look and edit and see that the actual rule created for the Rams is to use no more than then one primary player from Cam Akers, Darrell Henderson Jr., and Jake Funk, which is exactly what we wanted to do here. We can now go ahead and save this back as an auto rule, which now makes it a dynamic rule that will adjust even if the running backs on the teams change from now to Sunday. This rule will automatically adjust when it comes time to build your lineups on Sunday. You ready to go one step further? Let's add another group, and this time we're going to say if we're going to use a high-powered alpha wide receiver or tight end, a guy that's projected for more than 15 DraftKings points on average, we want to make sure we run that guy back with a player on the opposing team. Let's add a group that does that in just a few clicks. We're going to add another rule. It's going to be a group, and it's going to be another automatic rule. And this time we're going to say if at least one primary player is used, and in this case, we're only looking at wide receivers and tight ends. But this time we're going to add a stat requirement. A stat requirement is basically another conditional where the rule is only followed or the rule is only created if a particular player meets a stat threshold. So we'll add a stat requirement, and we're going to say that we're only looking at players whose average projection is greater than 15 points. For those players, if they're used in the lineup, we want to make sure that at least one secondary player, or let's say actually in this case, exactly one secondary player on the opposing team as the primary players is used, and we'll only count those as wide receivers or tight ends. We can even add another stat requirement here and say something like these players on the opposing side need to have an average projection greater than 10. Let's save these as manual rules here and go ahead and see what we get on the other side. We can go ahead and look at these here and expand these, and you see the rules get made. If Jalen Waddle, then must play Stephon Diggs or Gabe Davis. We can go back from this one and see if Travis Kelce, then must play Michael Pittman. Now, the coolest part about this is we use the manual rule to troubleshoot and to make sure that the rule logic got made the way we want, but now we can go back in and save this as an automatic rule, which means when the Sims update throughout the week and finally up to Sunday, when you go to build your final lineups, we'll recalculate what the new values of this rule should be, what new players should be included on each side of the rule, and rebuild your lineups correctly on Sunday. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, there are a ton of ways to use these new rules and a ton of power here, but I want to just walk through a couple other examples for some different sports to get you an idea of how this might work for other sports here. So for baseball, for example, let's say I don't want to use a particular hitter who has low overall power unless that player is paired in a stack of his other teammates. It's very easy to add a rule like that here. We'll go ahead and add a new rule. Again, this is going to be a group rule and it's an automatic rule. This one is a conditional because we're saying if one of these players is in the lineup, we want to follow the rule. So we'll say if at least one of these players is used, group by player in this case, all of the hitting positions, no pitchers here. And we're going to add a stat requirement this time that says home runs less than 0.1. And this is kind of an arbitrary number for this example, but it's a good baseline here to just see how the rule would work. If this is the case, then we want to make sure we use at least 4 other players on the same team as the primary players. If a player has low home run power and is used in the lineup, use him in a stack. We can go ahead here and save this again as the 62 manual rules to just see what these look like. And then go ahead and look at what this looks like here. And you can see the names here. A lot of these guys are sometimes lower home run power kind of guys. If Bubba Thompson, for example, then has to be a Rangers stack. Again, one thing we can do here is once we're happy with the way the rule is written, we can edit the rule, resave it as an auto rule, which will then make this rule dynamic and make it auto calculate as the home run odds change as new sims run throughout the day. NBA is going to be here before you know it, and I know a common thing people like to do there is avoid playing 2 studs from the same team in the same lineup. This is going to be super easy to do this NBA season. In this case, going back to some random slate from December 3rd of last year, we'll go ahead and create a new group here, make another automatic group, and in this case say use no more than 1 primary player. In this case, we're going to, again, group it by the team here. We don't want to use more than 1 player from the same team. And we're going to add a stat requirement and say that it only applies to players whose projection is greater than 40 points, for example. In this case, we'll go ahead and click Save as Manual Rule and go look at the rules. And you can see all of a sudden we're grouping out and avoiding playing Harden and Durant in the same lineup. We're avoiding playing LeBron and Anthony Davis in the same lineup. How about a little Formula One? In this case, if we're using a particular constructor, then we have to use a captain that races for the same team. Super easy to make this rule as well. Add new rule. It's a grouping rule. It's an automatic rule. And again, this is a conditional. If exactly one primary player is used, grouping this by players on the same team, and we're talking about a constructor here, then use exactly one secondary player on the same team as the primary player at the captain spot. We can save this, check to make sure the manual rule logic worked correctly, and in this case, we can see now if we are picking Ferrari as the constructor, then it needs to either be Leclerc or Sainz at captain. Are you guys having fun yet? Let's do one for MMA this time, and this time we're going to say if we're using a really heavy favorite on this particular card, then we want to make sure we have some underdogs in the lineup as well. We'll go ahead here and just click Add New Rule. We're going to add another group, and we're going to add another automatic group, and this time we're going to say if we're using at least one primary player, we're not going to group by player or team or game in this case. We're just going to say if that player's win probability, we have two pretty big favorites on this card, Pfeiffer and Zellhuber here. We're going to say if their win probability is greater than 70, then at least one secondary player whose win probability is less than, we'll say 40 in this case. We can go ahead and save the manual rule again here and take a quick look and just make sure the logic works here. Whoops. And we can see the rule worked exactly as expected. If we play one of these two big favorites, then we also have to play at least one of these bigger underdogs. Now, I'm sure at this point you are as excited as I am about these new rules, but before you go run off and start making them on your own, I want to give you a little bit of advice. First of all, remember that SaberSim is not just a dumb lineup optimizer. Because we have play-by-play game simulations of every game on the slate and upside correlations between every single player, we already understand a lot of what goes into making a really good lineup. So run a build without any groups or rules at all first, see how those lineups work and look, and then make your rules to adjust as you need from there. Second, because these rules and groups are so robust and powerful, it's easy to accidentally make mistakes and potentially make two different groups that conflict with each other when you don't realize. If you're running into issues where your build isn't completing or you're having a build that's running really slow, it's probably because you put in conflicting rules that aren't making it easy for the builder to find lineups. If that happens, just make use of the checkboxes here to turn the most recently added groups off and try another build. If you can get a build to run with a particular rule off, you know that rule somehow has a conflict and you should take another look at the logic. Now, we've truly only scratched the surface of what you can do with these powerful new rules, and the only thing better than watching me go through it is checking it out for yourself. SaberSim is the only DFS optimizer in the industry with a completely free 7-day trial, so go get signed up on our site, SaberSim.com. In the meantime, thank you for watching and good luck.